This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this latest witness seminar organised by the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in conjunction with OSPA. A very important announcement to make at the beginning. These lovely microphones in front of you are purely ornamental. They are completely useless. These sessions are being recorded, and we have the microphone at the front, so everything will be captured nicely. But unfortunately, I think we're probably all fairly experienced public speakers here, one way or another. We're quite used to projecting our voices, but do particularly remember, if you're asking questions at the end, to speak up loudly, please, and identify yourself. I'm Philip Murphy. I'm director of the Institute. Unfortunately, particularly unfortunately, Richard Rathbun can't make it. He's been in hospital recently, and it's a great shame because Richard is an expert on indirect rule in West Africa, and I'm really taking his place so far as I can, chairing this first session. But other speakers for the roundtable discussion at the end are all here. Let me just say a few words about this very important subject of indirect rule. Anyone who's taught undergraduate courses on British imperial history will know that probably the easiest way of surprising students is by asking them how many British administrators ruled vast territories like Nigeria and India, and then pointing out that the true figure was just a fraction of their estimate. In Nigeria, for example, in 1930, a population of around 20 million was ruled by fewer than 500 British administrators. And of course, you then explain to them that the way that was feasible was partly the system that we call indirect rule. It's also a commonplace to say that although the British had rather elevated indirect rule to a guiding principle through the work of Lord Lugard and his acolytes, even in the French territories, where there was supposedly a greater emphasis on promoting French culture and national citizenship, the logistics of governing large territories with limited resources meant that forms of indirect rule also largely pertained. Indirect rule, of course, took a variety of forms in the British Empire, from protected states whose rulers enjoyed significant degrees of autonomy to loosely defined forms of customary law harnessed somewhat awkwardly to the British administrative machine. Indeed, within what might refer to as a form of shorthand as a British colony, there could be a variety of forms of administration with different status. This clearly complicated the process of decolonisation, and I think this is something that I would be very interested to hear about from our witnesses. Indeed, it would probably be less time-consuming to list the territories like Tanganyika, where it didn't really complicate the transfer of power. I'm sure someone will tell me I'm wrong about the case of Tanganyika as well, than to list the countries like Uganda and Zambia, where it certainly did. But even less momentous administrative problems were complicated by indirect rule. Just to give you one example from my own work on the monarchy and empire Commonwealth. Civil servants, as we all know, love planning for contingencies. And one contingency that was planned for from the 1950s onwards, from 1952 onwards, was for the next monarch. Looking back at the example of 1952, where should the accession proclamation of the next British monarch be read out, and how and in what form in the British colonial territories? This process of planning went on from the mid-50s until there weren't really any colonial territories left, and luckily never had to be put into operation. But the Colonial Office, for example, was cautious about issuing an accession proclamation in the protected states, fearing that the rulers of those states might feel that their status had been undermined. Two especially customized drafts of the proclamation were prepared. One for the use in trusteeship territories and protectorates, and the second for the use in protected states. In the case of protected states, legal advisors at the Colonial Office went to great pains not to include anything that might encroach upon the dignity of traditional rulers. As they explained in a memo, quote, "An express acknowledgement of constant obedience would be inappropriate and unacceptable in protected states. Loyalty has tentatively been substituted for constant obedience, but this probably will also have to be omitted." And indeed, the prediction proved correct. The protected state of Tonga was unhappy with the word loyalty, and it was duly agreed that it should be dropped. Among there were other problems involved in producing a standard proclamation for a particular territory. For a start, there were a number of territories that were part colony and part protectorate. These included Aden, Sierra Leone, Gambia, Kenya, Nigeria, and the Western Pacific Islands, including the New Hebrides Condominium. And indeed, the Colonial Office seemed a little bit confused about what exactly the status of the New Hebrides Condominium was, and had to go through a number of further drafts. Among the protectorates, there were, of course, differences in the status of traditional rulers between, say, Zanzibar, Uganda, and Northern Rhodesia. The government of Uganda, for example, felt that the form of words in the proclamation should be that of the draft prepared for the protected states rather than one devised for protectorates. In particular, the Ugandan government felt that the reference to obedience might be taken as affront to the dignity of the Kabaka of Buganda. So, one sees immediately all sorts of problems talking about indirect rule. The wide variety of forms this took, each one bringing with it a particular set of sensitivities, and the fact that a single territory could contain a number of different forms of administration and indeed of indirect rule. The system of indirect rule has sometimes been blamed for the weaknesses of many post-colonial states, particularly in Africa. The argument goes that if Africans were encouraged until very late in the process of British rule to identify almost exclusively with their particular ethnic group, it should come as little surprise that post-independent states have suffered from ethnic and regional tensions, or that the sense of political morality in relation to the state should so often be so poorly developed. So these are the sorts of issues that I think it would be very interesting to hear more about. We also have a kind of a checklist of broader questions. How did Africa differ from, say, the princely states in India or Malaya? Would there have been indirect rule in British Africa without the Blue Card? Almost certainly yes. How did indirect rule become a favoured policy? Did financial considerations come into it? How did indirect rule affect the role of the district officer? Did indirect rule hamper the development of local or national democratic and representative government? And here I think one particularly misses the presence of Richard Rathbone. One of Richard's aphorisms that sticks in my mind is that, and apologies to those who might have been involved in this area in the UK more recently, that the most boring phrase in the English language is local government. And this may explain the neglect of changes in the administrative system leading up to independence at a local level, that historical attentions tended to focus pretty much on transfers of power at the central legislature. And Richard is one of the few people who have talked about attempts running up to independence to reform the local government system. So these are all things that I'd be very interested to hear about. I'm not going to, I think we shouldn't probably introduce our speakers at great length. To give them the chance really just to say at the beginning of their remarks where they served and what their expertise is. We will take our three witnesses in the order they appear, have questions at the end of the third presentation, so that you can perhaps ask the same question to a number of different witnesses. But it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce John Smith, whose testimony today is going to relate, I think, largely to Nigeria. Simon Gillett, who is really going to talk about Botswana, and Godfrey Meynell, who is going to talk about the Aden Protectorate. So if I can introduce John and just ask him to speak for 10 or 15 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I spent the best part of 20 years in Nigeria, 10 before independence and 10 after. I then went to the Western Pacific, where I served in the Solomon Islands and subsequently as governor of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands. So to indirect rule. I think indirect rule in its purest form was found in the informal empire, where British commercial interests were so dominant that there was no need to rule at all, for example in 19th century Argentina. But in considering indirect rule as a colonial policy, Nigeria is the obvious place to begin. Northern Nigeria became the temple of indirect rule, with Lugard's political memoranda as its Book of Common Prayer, and some would say with Marjorie Perham as its high priestess. While the Igbo people of eastern Nigeria provided the prime example of inappropriately applied indirect rule after a virtue was made of what began as a necessity. British commercial interests were active in West Africa from the 16th century, first with slavery and after 1807 with palm oil. British administration began with consulates, charged with the encouragement of British trade, the protection of British citizens, and the abolition of the slave trade. The colony of Lagos was created with reluctance in 1862, and 3 years later, the House of Commons agreed that further extension of territory would be inexpedient, and that the object of our policy should be to encourage in the natives the exercise of those qualities which may render it possible for us more and more to transfer to them the administration of all the governments. Protectorates rather than colonies became the chosen means for the British to participate in the scramble for West Africa. An indirect rule suited the status of a protectorate, and the Fulani emirates and the Kanuri kingdoms offered effective administrative structures, as in Niger Company days Goldie had foreseen. Given the resources available, for Lugard there was no other way. A population of over 7 million in an area of nearly 300,000 square miles was administered by a total British military and civilian establishment that even 8 years after the flag had been raised numbered only 399. Lugard also believed that the mode of life, the habits of thought and ceremonial of the Emirates had greater appeal than the prosaic, business-like habits of the Anglo-Saxon. Despite his Indian experience, the Indian princes were not his model. He wanted native administrations to be part of the one system of government. Thus, the Native Courts Proclamation of 1900 ensured that the bulk of litigation, both criminal and civil, was undertaken in the existing courts, which residents were empowered to establish by warrant, defining their powers and jurisdiction. The courts administered native law and custom, and awarded customary punishments, except any such as mutilation, repugnant to natural justice and humanity. Court appointments were made by the emir, with the approval of the resident, who had rights of access and review. In Muslim areas where alqalis, qadis, administered Sharia law, it worked well, but became fossilized. Prior to independence, it had to be updated by the appointment of a Grand Qadi as an appeal court for the whole country, and the introduction of a penal code modelled upon the Indian penal code that could be administered in all courts. An aspect of the effectiveness of the native courts in northern Nigeria was the difference it made to the duties of the district officer. I would sit in on native court sessions, inspect court records, and very occasionally review a case, usually because a low-grade court had exceeded its powers. But I sat as a magistrate in my 10 years or so as an administrative officer, I would think, for less than 10 times. A duty that my colleagues in southern Nigeria performed almost weekly. Another significant aspect of indirect rule introduced the beginnings of effective local government. An emir's court consisted of masusarauta, office holders with traditional titles such as Serikinduaiki, Master of the Horse. With the title went suzerainty and the right to tribute over various areas of the emirate. Rather like feudal England or absentee English landlords in Ireland in practice. Lugard insisted on the rationalisation of these areas into single administrative districts in which the title holders were required to live rather than at the emirate headquarters. They were paid salaries, authorised to collect taxes and fees for payment into the treasury. Although Lugard is blamed for indirect rule by its detractors, his residents, such as Temple and Palmer, living in isolation with no modern means of communication, were instrumental in developing the mystique that it acquired. It was Palmer who initiated the keystone of native administration, the Beit el-Mal, the treasury. Tribute was no longer to be paid to the emir, but taxes were collected, lodged in the treasury, and accounted for. A levy went to the Protectorate government. The rest was used to support the emir and his office holders, and as time went on, the provision of services. The residents had even more influence when Lugard left northern Nigeria in 1906 to be succeeded by Gillett, a railway engineer appointed to see through the extension of the railway to Kano. And that's really when the residents took over and this mystique got hold. And such was the mystique that with the amalgamation of the two protectorates of northern and southern Nigeria in 1914, on Lugard's return, what worked effectively in the Emirates with their centuries of Islamic tradition, Sharia law, and literacy was introduced into southern Nigeria, where the Yoruba kingdoms appeared to bear some similarity to the northern Emirates. But even there, it failed to put down roots. And among the peoples of eastern Nigeria, native authorities were set up by the stroke of a pen, composed of no more than placemen, persons with no tribal authority whatsoever, put in by the government to do work which they ought to have done themselves. Those are Cameron's own words after he had returned to Nigeria from Tanganyika. But that disaster played its part in the development of the one piece of colonial policy that every administrator from St Kitts to Pitcairn heard about, the Creech-Jones Local Government Dispatch of 1947, which recognised that indirect rule, called the Woad Policy by Andrew Cohen, had fossilised and was an impediment to the development of democratic self-government. Even in the decade before independence, the mystique lingered on. On arrival, I was taken to see the Emir before being sent on tour. I was discussed between my DO and the Emir in the third person over my head. Wherever I went, I had to be accompanied by an Emir's representative, old enough to be my grandfather and usually illiterate. I was supposed to address village meetings and converse with district heads through him. Conveniently, he usually fell asleep, occasionally wakening to announce, "You heard what the DO said, always boil your water," even though I was probably discussing some new constitutional change. A horse was my transport, because cadets and NGOs for cars were anathema for cadets in northern Nigeria. Officially recommended to provide a district head with a mat, should he call on me, I could be met at his border by the DH in his Buick, offered a lift to district headquarters, where I either accepted his hospitality or languished in an empty rest house until my loads, carried on people's heads, arrived several hours later. One district head of whom I became particularly fond always sent me on my way in his car with my servants and loads following in his lorry. Most funding was channeled through the native authority, with government departmental staff working through the NA. It was responsible for primary education. The NA Works Department acted as agent for the maintenance of government roads. The hospital was usually a government hospital, but all district dispensaries would be native authority, staffed by native authority, paid for by native authority. The NA budget was a key document. And more often than not, if the estimates were to meet the deadline every year, somebody like myself would be instructed by their resident to get down to the NA offices and see that they got drafted, which meant, in fact, you did it yourself, indirect rule or not. And I sometimes felt that my role was essentially that of a new age palace eunuch. It could be frustrating. And as I wrote in Colonial Cadet, my memoir of that time, what I liked least about indirect rule was its power to corrupt. One could easily be turned into a Pontius Pilate. Very easy to wash your hands and say it's the NA's fault. But with hindsight, on the positive side, it was a good discipline, because you had to learn to carry people with you, however difficult the negotiations, making them believe that the objective had been their idea and not your own.
Thank you very much indeed. Son.
I spent, after national service in northern Nigeria, I spent 8 years in what became Botswana. While I was there, having started as the Bechuanaland Protectorate, I was the district commissioner and held various other administrative appointments. Botswana, or most of what is now Botswana, became a British protectorate in 1885, at a time when the term hadn't come to denote any form of trusteeship for its inhabitants. All it amounted to was to establish title without admitting sovereignty or the obligations of sovereignty. Not my words, but those of a considerable authority. What it did was it kept the Germans in southwest Africa out, and it kept the Transvaalers, Kruger's Boers to the east out of an area straddling what Cecil Rhodes liked to call the road to the north. By 1900, the bare bones of the colonial administration nevertheless had been put in place, and there were frontiers and tribal boundaries surveyed and demarcated. The Protectorate, from then until the 1930s, was nevertheless, in the words of one commentator, more often and more accurately described as under the parallel rule of native chiefs and British officials, rather than under indirect rule by the latter, as understood in contemporary Nigeria. However, during the 1930s, and largely as a result of agitation by the leading chiefs, particularly the Bangwato regent, Sekedi Kama, Bangwato by far the biggest of the 8 Tswana tribes. A system of native administration based on that, developed in Nigeria and Tanganyika by Lugard and Cameron, was introduced by 2 activist resident commissioners, which is what they called the governor, Ray and Aden Clark, the man who was later the last governor of the Gold Coast. As a later resident commissioner, Anthony Sillery wrote in 1952, he published a history of the Protectorate, quote, "The chiefs, confirmed by long use in a position of high authority, are noticeably self-reliant, and the district commissioner in general exercises little primary executive authority and confines himself to giving advice and guidance. Nor is frequent resort had by the people to the DC's appellate powers. In general, the people accepts the word of the native administration as final." That was 1952. In Sillery's view, quote again, "The native administrations are at their best satisfactory instruments of local government. Their strongest point is their enthusiasm for social services, particularly education, and their weakest is finance. They are still based in the past and in tribal tradition. In my view, the native authorities, not perhaps without difficulty, will be able in the end to adapt themselves to changing conditions." Unquote. It only remains to add that from about Sillery's time, 1950 onwards, the authority of the chiefs was further strengthened by their membership of the Resident Commissioner's African Advisory Council, which sat and advised him separately from a European Advisory Council. It was only at the end of the 50s that the 2 advisory councils were merged as a joint advisory council, and only in 1961 was a legislative council set up, and then on a very limited franchise, which gave equal weight effectively to the 3,000 European traders and ranchers, and then about 400,000 Africans. They went on to a common role in 1965, and at long last, one man had one vote in this corner of British Africa. As a corollary, while the resident commissioner continued to preside over the cabinet, real executive power passed to the first Prime Minister, Seretse Khama, the nephew of Sekedi Khama and the rightful chief of the Bamangwato, but now Prime Minister. He'd been elected MP himself and led the moderate Bechuanaland Democratic Party set up with British connivance to upstage more radical parties allied to the ANC and the Communist Party in South Africa. By the time Seretse Khama died in 1980, he had built Botswana into a wealthier, more confident and better governed nation state than any other in Africa, and even some of us would argue in the developing world. But there are some evident anomalies about Botswana's democratic credentials. One is that the current president in 2012 is not only a Lieutenant General, but also Seretse Khama's eldest son. But for those of us, and I'm sure there's many here, who've known Southern Africa over the last 60 years, the really startling anomaly is that President Ian Khama's mother was white and born Ruth Williams in London. I contend that indirect rule as it took hold after 1885 in the Bechuanaland Protectorate was the essential precondition to Botswana's success as an independent republic. Without indirect rule, 3 generations of the Khama family would have been in no position to challenge the acts, omissions and intentions of British ministers, and the disreputable transaction into which HMG entered to prevent Ruth and Seretsi's marriage would not have been necessary. As a consequence, not only Botswana, but Lesotho and Swaziland as well would have been absorbed into South Africa well before South Africa became a republic in 1961. Of course, it has to be conceded that there was a price for indirect rule in Botswana, which was developmental neglect due to lack of funds to develop either infrastructure or social services. And this was pointed out vigorously by left-wing commentators in Britain, not only left-wing, and indeed and particularly by successive South African governments who sought greater control of their economic hinterland. South Africa was in a customs union with the 3 protectorates. But it was a price in the end worth paying, and was my particular good fortune, as for 6 of my 8 years working for what became Botswana, I was a district officer, for which Tswana word Malawi means ruler, the lawgiver, and as such it seemed to me I could help Seretsi and his ministers build a democracy. I was encouraged by the absence of radical rhetoric from anywhere in the government. No African socialism a la Tanzania, and no nationalist tub-thumping. One Zambia, one nation, Kenneth Kaunda proclaimed in a speech in Lebatsi in 1968. And it is said that a wag at the back shouted, "One Botswana, 8 nations," there being 8 tribes. Seretsi and all his ministers, but particularly Kwetmaseri, his vice president and successor, knew they had no money at independence and immediately got down to developing Botswana from below. The Democratic Party's cry, "Ipelaheng, lift yourselves," was exactly that of the Community Development Department, and the thrust and focus given to local government by replacing tribal treasuries, which had been founded on the Nigerian model, with elected district and town councils, led almost immediately to much enhanced local revenues paid by everyone, and very much increased school enrollments. The latter was most remarkable, because in the month of independence, school fees were trebled. Indirect rule, it seems to me, had most thoroughly prepared Botswana's leaders for running their own independent republic.
Thank you very much indeed.
Aden, near the tip of southern Arabia, a deep water port which came into British hands in 1837 and which we then held for 130 years. To the southwest, the Horn of Africa, the source of the occasional conqueror of slaves and of the noxious cart wheat. To the northeast, a gradually drying landscape full of history and prehistory, extending to the Rub el Khali, the great desert of Arabia. To the north, Arabia fades, an irrigated land with good rainfall, tangled mountains, and a most difficult terrain to administer. And there, from there most of the political weather came as well. I know nothing about the Eastern Aden Protectorate, and my talk will be concerned entirely with the Western Protectorate and Aden itself. Aden was the only objective of British administration. The Protectorate was a buffer, an afterthought, and for a long time a skeleton in the imperial cupboard. Treaties were made with tribal chiefs in order to preserve their independence from the imams of Yemen and their Turkish overlords, whose influence varied during the period. In that time, the only interest of the British was to maintain the borders of their protected area and to, apart from a few historians and travellers, simply to forget about it. From 1914, when the Turks in the First World War came very close to Aden, we had to become more involved. Many of the tribes with which we had alliances helped us in eventually expelling the Turks. From then on, the only challenge to our authority in the north was the newly independent imams of Yemen. They ran a tyrannical show, but we vaguely protected a completely anarchic situation. During the interwar period, a series of remarkable men, political officers, typified by Hamilton, later Lord Belhaven, tried not only to safeguard the borders against a rampant Islam, against occasional incursions and a great deal of stirring up of our tribes and distributions of weapons and so on, by building relations of confidence and trust with the various rulers. And indirect rule seems to me to be based absolutely on that factor: trust, confidence, and even friendship. Belhaven and his colleagues also had the ultimate sanction of the RAF base in Aden. If a tribe tried to interfere with the trade routes to Aden, then after due warnings, leafleting and so forth, houses would be destroyed by the RAF. And usually that was a sufficient disincentive. Local forces began to be established. The rulers were given stipends to recruit local forces, and that at the same time, in Aden itself, protectorate-wide forces were raised, at least in nucleus. So there was a pretty big skeleton in the imperial cupboard come the Second World War. After the Second World War, various pressures drove Britannia to change her policy. For one thing, the Imam could now look to the forces of Arab nationalism and also international communism to supply resources to disrupt our rule in Aden and our protectorate. The forward policy then developed involved the creation of new treaties, advisory treaties, where British officers, now called assistant advisors, would join the rulers in their various widely differing situations and help them develop local administrations. A great success was the discovery that cotton could be grown in the two major deltas to the east and west of Aden. And the two states which primarily benefited from those saw a degree of urbanization, a degree of peace and stability. Similarly, from the various other states in their widely differing circumstances, small administrations were able to spread a little commerce, a little development, and peace, a certain amount of peace, into this anarchic tribal situation. It was natural that these tribes themselves were federations, and it was natural that as pressures grew from outside, the tribes should be encouraged to think about federating. And in 1959, the plunge was taken, and 6 of the most important tribes, or rather their rulers, entered into a federation. A very good start was made. An administration building was set up in Aden. A number of our best Arab and British officers were posted to it and became permanent secretaries. And the ministers, for the most part, were wise, humane, good men, and they were guided by Trebascus, the architect of the Federation, and a former straightforward colonial servant, into developing a system which would eventually be extended to absorb the colony of Aden. Meanwhile, Aden colony had become a first-class advertisement for imperialism, added to the deep water port, where a thriving oriental city, the headquarters of British forces Middle East, and a substantial oil refinery transferred from Persia. The democracy did not exist, but the administration was guiding the local population in the direction where then democracy was supposed to lie. The tension between a population used to British law and security and a great degree of urbanization and the good things of modern life was faced with the possibility of being merged and dominated by this protectorate, which had so recently emerged from the shadows. And yet, the nationalists who looked to the alternatives of Arab nationalism spearheaded by Egypt, or communism, were in fact hopelessly misguided. And they would have been far better to have stuck with a system where the British oversaw a merger of the Protectorate with Aden to the alternatives they eventually embraced. In 1962, the Imam in the Yemen was overthrown. His spoon had not been long enough, and the Egyptians who had supported him before now organized a revolution. And from that time, Egyptian intelligence officers were on the frontiers of the Protectorate. Related development money arrived from the Treasury. Morale held firm. The RAF were in the sky. Substantial Arab forces and British forces were on the ground. Despite all the pressures, a great deal was done, too little and too late. But there was a great deal of goodwill for the British. The experience of working with Arab soldiers in particular, the police force that was raised to support the Protectorate from all the tribes, was the most exhilarating experience I've had in my life. At the last moment, we were suddenly able to dig wells, to make mountain roads, to get to increase the number of primary and intermediate schools, and do all the things that should have been done so long before. I had a great admiration for the rulers. I believe that a number of them could have been very successful in effecting the transfer. I think that their people would have been far better under them than they would under the brutal communist dictatorship which followed and was succeeded by a very anarchic situation in the Greater Yemen. I think my final word must be that indirect rule seems to me to depend on confidence and trust. And in old age, I still feel the pain of the betrayal that we perpetrated. There's never been such a bonfire of treaties, except perhaps with the Indian Maharajas, in the history of the world. I don't to mention.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to our three witnesses for excellent presentations. We now open the discussion up to the floor. As I said before, I'd be grateful if people could identify themselves first, speak up and keep your comments or questions reasonably brief, because I think that a lot of people will probably want to say something. So please. Yes.
If I could just add a footnote to Godfrey's regarding the Protectorate from the perspective of the East Name Protectorate.
So your name is, please?
My name is John Ducker, and my colleague here was also at East Name, so he may have something to add. There were significant differences between the East Name Protectorate and the West Name Protectorate. The East Name Protectorate didn't have this threat, as it were, from the Yemen. There were far fewer rulers. There were only 4. One of them joined the Federation of South Arabia when that was created. The other 3 did not. The largest of these was the Gillett estate, which had its origins in the army of the Nizam of Hyderabad. They had an administration of their own. They had revenues from import duties, and to some extent were self-sufficient. We did not have magisterial powers, as Godfrey did not either in the West End Protectorate.
Can you keep speaking up, please?
Yes. But we did help to keep law and order because the resident advisor for the East Labour Protectorate had a force called the Hadouet Bedouin Legion, which was paid for by the British government. And this force could be deployed where it was required. Most of the time we had garrison duties along the border with Saudi Arabia, but it also operated elsewhere. So we could reinforce the states in their duty of maintaining law and order. They were very different, these states. As I mentioned, one of them joined the Federation. One of them, the ruler of Mahra and Sokoto, when he was asked by a British minister a year before independence whether he planned to bring his state into the Federation, said, no, not at all. I'm quite happy with the treaty that we signed with Queen Victoria. In the end, there was no solution because these states, they couldn't devise anything of their own. They did not join the Federation. And they were overwhelmed by the force that came to power in Aden and the Western Aden Protectorate. There's one final point. Godfrey referred to the forward policy. You may not have picked that up. What was referred to there was some people advocated that we ought to get deeply involved in the Aden Protectorate and administer it like a typical colony. Others said, don't do it. Just stay in the background. Pay these subsidies to the state, let them organise themselves. And this has been interesting historically because the other states of the coast of Arabia, all the way up to Kuwait, which were also protectorates. Now, before the discovery of oil, they received virtually no assistance from the British government. And it is thought that somehow they retained the legitimacy of their rule in those areas more effectively because they did not have much British government involvement. It's something that people disagree about.
Thank you very much indeed. Comments, question, please. Yes.
Could I just ask, Godfrey, why Botswana seems to have been so successful as a nation in Africa? I would like to put out 2 or 3 reasons. First is that there may have been 8 different tribes, as you referred to, but in fact they were basically all Setswana, and seemed to me, from my experience working with them, to have got on remarkably easily in quite a different way from what you might have found in Kenya and many other African countries. Secondly, they were interested in development, and unlike other countries in which certainly I've worked, they were not worried about importing expatriates. As long as the expatriates kept out of cattle and more sensitive areas, they were given a very free hand, provided they succeeded. In other countries, there's always been someone looking over one's shoulder, which has made life, I think, less productive. Thirdly, and perhaps lastly, they did find diamonds and used the wealth rather wisely. Could you comment?
Would you just like to put your name on the record?
I'm sorry, Win Riley. Sorry.
Quite
I
right.
spent a couple of years in Botswana as a Ministry of Local Government, 1978 to 80.
Well, 10 years after I left. You're quite right. And certainly the fact that European expatriates stayed on, that we were all offered citizenship. When the president, I was offered it myself. I didn't opt for it because it would have meant a drop in salary. My salary was supplemented from London, and I couldn't spare the supplement.
Fair enough.
I don't think I would have taken it on anyway because I was out there with my wife and children. But several of my ableist colleagues, I'd like to name them. Phil Steenkamp, who had been district commissioner in Francistown, one of the ablest colonial officials of his generation. And I'm saying that very confidently because his work was all done after independence. He came from Eldoret. He was came from an Afrikaner family and was educated at the University of Grahamstown. The University of, what's it called? Yes, Grahamstown. And he could see what was coming for some reason. He never struck me as particularly, quote, liberal, unquote. But he was a brilliant administrator, a good lawyer, and Seretse-Khama's right-hand man. The other man was another South African, also British, and in fact he'd been to Oxford, Quill Hermans. He was an economist, as he'd like to tell the administrators, and he built up the economy by negotiating with the World Bank for loans and so on, and with Steenkamp helped first the negotiations with De Beers, Anglo-American, Harry Oppenheimer, over the Arapa diamonds, and secondly, what in those days was called the Chashi project, which was going to develop 2 copper-nickel mines in northeastern Botswana, for which the infrastructure was going to cost 2.5 times the gross national product, the figure I had in mind. That was all organised by these 2 men. There's a third who's known to, I think, Frank Kennedy, who's here, Hugh Murray Hudson, who in fact stayed on in Botswana but working for the mining company. And there was complete harmony between these officials and the political leadership. They knew they needed each other. And of course, the bottom line was, if they didn't cooperate, the South Africans would get in. Seretse-Khama refused to have diplomatic representation from the Republic of South Africa, on principle. He didn't have an ambassador in Pretoria, and he didn't have and South Africa was not allowed an ambassador in Gaborone. But otherwise, relationships were excellent, and the first thing the Hermans did was to renegotiate the customs agreement to make it much more favourable to Botswana and the other 2 territories. So there's all sorts of reasons for Botswana's success, but I still maintain that at the centre of it was the experience that the chiefs gained in the earlier generation, Sekedi Khama's generation. He learned how to manage white men. He learned how to distinguish between those who were basically supporting the ideas of democracy and colourblind systems of government and the people down in what became the Republic of South Africa.
Godfrey, would like to say anything in response to the comments about any comments about
Well, I think the question of whether we could have simply left the protectorates, I don't know how far it would have been possible in the East, where you achieved a great deal more, disarming the tribes and so on, partly because you were slightly out of the swing of the sea. But I think after the war it had become very hard to avoid expanding. And the anarchic situation had become worse. As you'll see in my paper, the anarchic situation had undoubtedly become worse by the distribution of arms from both sides in the interwar period, and spectacularly later. And that was an even worse skeleton in the cupboard, the whole business of the arms. But I myself have dug wells and built schools with rifle ammunition, supplied thankfully by the Treasury, because it was so much cheaper than real money. But things haven't changed much, have they? The only difference is that now we supply the arms as before, but we dig the wells here. The profits come home, and the harm continues to be done. But I'm very sorry that I didn't have the East Aden Protectorate experience. And even in the West, I didn't really see those parts which have an ancient history going back far beyond the Queen of Sheba.
Peter Slim, my only witness status, I suppose, is that I was a legal advisor in the Commonwealth office in the last year of its life before the merger with Bechuanaland. I dare say anything about Aden, about which I know nothing, but I do remember reading the telegrams at the time of the handover, or the evacuation, the assumption of the government by Flossie. You all remember Flossie, the front of the liberation? And because it was, I suppose, just make a quick comment about it was the only example, apart from Palestine, where there was no orderly constitutional process of handover, which even happened in the end in Zimbabwe. But if I may turn to an area which I know a little more about, the comment I would like to make about Botswana, in the context of Swaziland and Lesotho. Now, Botswana, I think we all agree, has been one of the most successful independent countries in Africa, and all sorts of reasons which many know better than I. But it's a bit dangerous, I think, to say that, well, that's because it was, a protectorate with a well-established how can I put it, tribal hierarchy. In other words, it was traditional indirect rule carrying on through to independence, I can put it that way. Because, unfortunately, I would suggest, and I don't know others may wish to comment about this, that the independent history of Lesotho and Swaziland would seem to enjoy the benefits of traditional monarchy, ethnic homogeneity, and a boundary, not one of those artificial constructs which is much criticised for the problems that many other African countries have had. In fact, their post-independence constitutional and political development has been pretty unhappy. And Swaziland in particular, which I've been concerned with in the last few years, is probably one of the worst governed countries in Africa.
I think this underlines the point I made, which is the lack of a paramount chief. The Khama family were not the paramount chiefs of the Botswana. They were one of 8 chiefs. They had more subjects than anyone else, but they were still essentially one among another. The king of Swaziland was a completely different person. And the analogy of the relationship between the 3 High Commission territories was simply that they all benefited from the renegotiation of the customs agreement, which was led by Botswana with its very well entrenched and enterprising white advisors. Lesotho is a bit somewhere in between. It had a king, and he did his best, but he was the paramount chief, and the South Africans, I think, knew that he could be got rid of. And after all, both countries were entirely surrounded by South Africa, and much more vulnerable to pressure from it than Botswana was.
Please, yes.
Could I ask a question to John Smith, please? My name is Mike Gould. My particular interest is the Nigerian Civil War. I've just recently produced a book on the subject. And my question really is, what effect do you think indirect rule had on the sort of background causes to the war?
there's no doubt about it that the difference in administration between North and South did produce a tension. Indeed, in my day, it used to be said that if the Nigerians left Nigeria, the British in the South would fight the British in the East. We were very different. Our whole styles of operation were totally different. And although there was that important middle belt, where certainly if you were in the administration in the North, you couldn't behave in the same way as you did in Sokoto or Kano or Katsina, I don't think it was an effective buffer that sort of brought a nice convergence by any manner of means. I said I sometimes felt I was a bit of a palace eunuch, and I think it is interesting that we did stay on in northern Nigeria. I mean, I stayed on to the end of the Civil War. And I think, and there were certainly people who did the same in eastern Nigeria, but not to the same degree as happened in the north. And that was largely because of the northernization policy, which I wouldn't say was a cause of the war, but it did create fiction. There are a lot of misconcepts. I've read your book with great interest, incidentally. I mean, people would often say that the Sabangaris, the new towns in the north, where southerner Nigerians had to live, didn't have to, but on the whole they did in most places, were an example of them not being liked and so on and so forth. I think, in fact, it was to enable them to run things as they wanted, to build the sorts of houses that they wanted to build, to have courts that dealt with themselves, to have their own systems of local government up to a point. I think it was probably quite an enlightened system, actually, not something that would have caused war. I find it difficult to say that indirect rule as such created difficulties. I think what indirect rule did do was give people in the north an extraordinary sense of importance and power. And I was Deputy Secretary to Amadou Bello, Premier of the North, when he first had a northern secretary. And he as a young man was a modernizer, and it would have been great had he adopted that path. But as he became very important politically in the region, so I think he turned his mind backwards. Shehu Damfodio was his great hero, and he ran the country very much like a pre-Lugard style emirate in many ways. I mean, he held court. All my northern colleagues had to go and pay homage to Megiddo, as they called it, Master of the House, in the evening. I remember I persuaded the government house to give up their snooker table to put into a new club in the north. Because on the whole, Muslims didn't enjoy the other clubs, which were mainly drinking dens. And it was very popular, and I would often go there and be playing snooker with people. Time came, they all say, we're off, and off they went. They hated it, many of them, the younger men who wanted things to change. And I was there in the first coup, and I remember what so many of them said to me then. It was a great relief. But it didn't last, and I think in that sense there was a great sense of self-righteousness and power, and we should be on top, and so on and so forth, which was part of the antagonism, perhaps. The other factor that was quite important was that indirect rule definitely kept education at bay in the north. The schools were native authority schools, missions on the whole kept out of Muslim areas, and even when I arrived in Kano in 1951, they had actually closed a primary school in the city that previous year for lack of support. And we all were very complacent and said, oh, one day there'll be a demand for education. Girls' education was absolutely, not on, really. And so when it came to staffing technical jobs especially, in southern Nigerians had to be employed. And it could be difficult. I mean, go into a post office, every clerk in the post office will be a southern Nigerian. The people queuing up might well be northern Nigerians, and they were treated with contempt, there's no doubt about it, by the literate southerner on the other side of the counter. And certainly when the massacres and so on occurred in 1966, a lot of it was people taking revenge often on their Igbo landlords, who they'd grown to dislike. They could be very effective. I mean, the Igbos were remarkably talented in so many ways, and certainly technically. I crossed the Sahara in 1955, I think it was, and I found Igbo mechanics right the way across the desert, practically up into Algeria. They had that dynamism, enterprise, and because they'd been subjected to Western education, I think they were forging ahead in so many ways that the Northerners were not. So I think that's a background to the war. I wouldn't say it was a specific cause.
Thanks very much. There's a question from the gentleman.
Frank Kennedy. I served in eastern Nigeria from 1953 for 10 years. Subsequently, I spent some time in Dar es Salaam. And in the Foreign Service, I returned to Nigeria as a Deputy High Commissioner and later on was Ambassador in Angola. John has given us a lucid exposition of the application of indirect rule in northern Nigeria and the absence of that application in the provinces of what was southern Nigeria. I won't quarrel with all of the analysis of the function of the Igbos in the run-up to the Civil War. I do think there was one very depressing experience. As the war was beginning, a group of us used to meet at the Civil Service Club of Whitehall. And every second Monday, there would be about 20 of us. Some had served in northern Nigeria, some had served in west or eastern Nigeria. And the depressing thing was that the meetings always broke up in violent disagreement, as the Northerners blamed the Igbos, and we Igbos did the opposite. It does seem a little bit depressing that local loyalty, can be so incendiary. To John's lucid exposition, I just repeat what he said about the legal system. Although as a fabric of executive function, indirect rule was not applied in eastern Nigeria, there was one respect in which it was very important, and that was the customary courts, the native courts. And it has been said, at least I've been told, that the former Attorney General, Sir Louis Mbanifo, in the years as the country slid down into the calamity of war, he went round and ensured that all the customary court records were safeguarded, removed, and stored. But I have never seen them printed. There is an archive in England of eastern Nigeria documents of note. If those customary court records still exist, I think the Institute of Commonwealth Affairs, we should really make an effort to retrieve them and make them available. Just to add to John's analysis, just before the war and immediately after independence, there was in eastern Nigeria introduced a House of Chiefs. Now this was introduced on the suggestion of Lagos, as it was, but it was warmly welcomed both by those who became chiefs and the ruled. And I think it's an interesting point, because the House of Chiefs, which inherited some of the personnel of the native authorities, would be a very feeble organization as far as executive rule is concerned. But it did have an important point in taking account of the traditional establishment of traditional rulers. It was warmly welcomed both by the locals and by the national political parties operating at that time. And it's an interesting point to consider whether we divide these honorific titles from the executive title. And I'd like to ask John what he thinks. There seems to me to have been an increase in the use of traditional titles and traditional roles in Nigeria. The role of the Oba of Benin, the Obi of Onitsha, have survived through the turbulence of the war. But now there are more traditional rules, I think, in common use than before. And we don't, it would be unthinkable to refer to Mr. Udoji instead of Chief Udoji. But we don't say Chief Asiodu today. We are asked to say the Ozumba of Asaba. And more this is the case. So in that respect, there is a little growth of the honorific function. Rather, as you might say, in our counties, we have the lieutenancy. We have the Lord Lieutenant and our Deputy Lieutenants, and we are pleased if we can put DL after our name.
Thank you very much. I'll take one or two further brief comments and then let them. Yes.
I am Don Barton. I am on the list to speak this afternoon, but quite coincidentally, I was regional director of Midwest Nigeria with the British Council at the time the Biafran War started. And in fact, it erupted in the vicinity of my house when the Biafran army occupied the Midwestern state. No, it was a very gentlemanly lot the Biafran army was compared with members of the Federal Army at that time. Now, I'm ventriloquizing here. It was a general perception there at the time that in the run-up to the Biafran War breaking out, that Awolowo, the Western Nigeria Prime Minister, was determined to dilute the influence of Eastern Nigeria in the federal government, and that he was conspiring with the northern leaders to put the East in their place. And the Biafran War, in effect, was a preemptive strike. And John Smith might care to comment on whether that view is right or not.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Pramit Singh, essentially a Kenyan, lived in Kenya, but with periodic exposures to the three territories in southern Africa, but that's Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland. I think in all the interventions made, and as far as indirect rule is concerned, the proximity of South Africa, which surrounded all these three countries, must have had a tremendous influence on what happened as far as governance of these three countries is concerned. Location of Gaborone, for instance, on the borders with South Africa, And all these civil servants from Whitehall who went and worked there not only imbued the South African influence through consumption of castle beer, but their shopping, daily shopping for groceries was always indulged across the border in southern Africa. And they were in fact the conduits of the influence of South Africa in those three territories, which explains to a large extent the discipline that one observes in Botswana, for instance, with civil service, which has completely broken in other sub-Saharan countries now in South Africa. And the other point that is very outstanding is the homogeneity, ethnic homogeneity of the indigenous population, by and large, which has contributed enormously to the governance, the status quo of governance in these three countries. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take final.
My name is Kay Whiteman. I was for many years the editor of the magazine West Africa, now no longer with us. I was very struck by what John Smith had to say. I quote, "Indirect rule kept education at bay, particularly education of girls." Those of us that still try to understand what is going on in Nigeria are fairly concerned about the present situation in northern Nigeria, particularly the northeast. But the arrival of Boko Haram, for instance, and seems a sort of continuation in some ways of the Maitat Singing movement. There's a sort of grassroots underlying problem there that has never really been addressed. And the statistics of education, certainly in the far north, are still very disappointing. Friends of mine, actually Muslims in Lagos, with a movement called Ansar-ud-Din, which was set up in the 1920s to further precisely Western-type education for Muslims, because they realized they were getting behind. They have tried to talk to people in the far north in Nigeria about stepping up education. There still seems to be a serious gap. I'd be very interested to have your comments on that.
Okay, I'll allow each member of the panel just to say a few concluding remarks and to respond to any of those points.
Well, the point I think I'd like to make is that I think indirect rule is much more tolerable for Muslims in relation to Christians. They know they're going to heaven. They very much doubt if we are. And to be actually ruled by somebody else is jolly difficult for them. So I think that some kind of indirect rule was certainly, even if the West Aden Protectorate had had in it anything that was worth making a colony out of. So I think it was indirect rule or nothing. I feel I haven't done any justice to my colleagues who brought enormous experience from the Tochi Scouts, from Sudan, from Nigeria, and it was Roy Somerset from Nigeria who said, who coined the phrase "a skeleton in the imperial cupboard." But I think I'd like to finish by just to emphasizing the enormous respect I have for my rulers. I heard from my Emir last Christmas. He's managed to get his children, in exile, he's managed to get his children educated. His son is a big wheel in Middle Eastern finance. Several others of them have done extraordinarily well. And I do think that Plessy was mentioned. Of course, Plessy the irony of the whole thing was that the Egyptian propaganda was brilliant and undermined us, but it was the communists, not Flossie, who scooped the pool at the end of it. And both Russia and Egypt had passed their peak very soon after we gave up. And steady nerves could have seen us through, as they did in the Gulf.
Thank you very much.
I quite agree with those who pointed out, including the last speaker, that the development of Botswana and also Swaziland and Lesotho has been enormously influenced by their being part of the South African Customs Union. As Mr. Singh said, we all went down to Johannesburg to do our shopping. And it wasn't only Europeans, whether South African or Rhodesian or from Britain, who went to Joburg for their shopping. It was most of those Africans who could afford to go there. Vice versa, I remember meeting a girl at the wedding of one of the leading chiefs, to Chief Lynchry. She came from the Transvaal branch of the tribe, the Bakatla tribe. And she worked in the CNA in Johannesburg. I was an official in the Treasury at the time, and we were desperately short of secretaries, because the white women that had been employed when the government was down in Mafeking in South Africa, as it was until 1964, they didn't want to come and work in the Protectorate, except it was too dusty. So I asked this girl, would she come and work in the Treasury? There were good terms, no colour bar and so on. She said, this dusty dork, you must be joking. And now Botswana is just as sophisticated. I've been to Gaborone as most places in South Africa. And it has a much stronger currency. But I would perhaps like to add that the influence of the missionaries, starting with Moffat in 1830 or so, his son-in-law Livingstone among the Bechuanaland, the missionaries to the first Khama, or Khama III he's called, Khama the Great, who incidentally knew Lugard when he was on an expedition for a mining company in 1896. Lugard said, I don't usually dine with my own men when they're other ranks, and I certainly don't often dine with natives. But he's a gentleman. And he was the most extraordinary man. So was Sekedi, and so was Seretse, who I had the privilege of knowing. And perhaps that's what made the difference, but one has to put it in institutional terms, and perhaps the Khamas, with the help of their chiefly colleagues in the smaller tribes, are what made the difference.
Thank you very much, John. Well, perhaps I'll begin with a point made by Kay Whiteman. Education kept at bay by indirect rule. I think one has to accept that Islam and the literacy that it brought was something that satisfied them. They didn't see the need for Western education in those days. And I think you have to accept that generation of most of us in this room, I was at secondary school in the 30s. What percentage in this country had secondary education in those days? I think it was under 12%. And how many went on to universities? 2 or 3%. Very, very few. We just assumed this didn't have to happen. Primary education, well, they were learning the Quran, they went to the Quranic schools, that will be all right. And I think indirect rule sort of fossilized that. They didn't want us. And it's very interesting as to what's happened since independence. My northern friends all tell me that they disliked what they were getting of Western education, largely through the cinema, through books and so on and so forth. They said, you're too liberal by half, and our children don't behave properly if they get too westernized. And I think this is something that I've heard right up to Christmas Day this year. when one of my Muslim friends, who always rings me on Christmas Day, was saying precisely that. So I think it is still an important element. When I went back to Nigeria a couple of years ago, I went to a school with the chap who'd then been headmaster of it, that had been a primary school, senior primary school in Aden, with, I suppose, about 120 kids. It now had something like 5,000. But what sort of education they're getting, I don't know. It's not all that. I mean, there's literacy in English, perhaps, but there's not much more than that in many, many ways. So I think education has suffered, and the Boko Haram, we keep you at bay, we don't like what you do, is clearly very, very significant. And of course, relations between Christians and Islam have become much more sharp than they were in my day. In the 50s, Nigeria was, northern Nigeria, an amazingly tolerant country, and I'm quite shaken with what's happened with the polarization of the religions. If we turn to the question of the Civil War and Awolowo, I think one has to remember, difficult to be exact, and we have somebody here who's much more expert in these matters than I am now, but I think the timing of the first coup was certainly affected by the outrageously rigged elections in the Western region, which had taken place in the December prior to January 1966. I spent Christmas Eve of that year in the brigade mess in Kaduna, and I remember we had a raffle, and when the brigadier won something, everyone rigged. I mean, it was a matter of joking. And in fact, 15 days later, he was my neighbour. He'd been killed by some of his majors. I think the West was in an awful mess. Awolowo was in prison, of course, and Gowan, after the counter-coup, released him in the hope, I think, of appeasing the West. And I think that politics was probably pretty sound. When the Biafrans invaded the Midwest, I mean, had they actually gone on, and of course it'd been led by somebody else, and so on, I think they might well have won the war, because if they got through to Lagos, who knows what the West would have done. I mean, I think it's an extremely interesting position, and talk about it. And coming finally to Frank's question about chiefs, I think it is true, chieftaincy has become more significant in some parts of Nigeria. I know Mr. Gould has an Igbo chieftaincy title. What is interesting is that no Englishman was ever given any title in northern Nigeria, either in the days of empire or since. They would regard that as quite outrageous. They believe in chieftaincy in its right way. We all had Hausa nicknames, but never a title. And it's interesting that what has happened in the north since independence has been that they have actually been able to break up some of the emirates. So when I was in Kano 2 years ago, what had been the emirate of Kano in my day was now something like 5 different emirates. Now that would have been unthinkable to the British administration to break the power of the Emirate of Kano, but it's been done since independence. So in a curious way, I think while in the East they enjoy the title and everyone's chief this and chief that, and to the West to some extent, in the North they're saying these guys are too powerful, let's cut them down to size.
Thank you very much. Lunch beckons next door. We reconvene at 2 o'clock. But before we go for lunch, let's express our thanks to our witnesses for 3 excellent presentations.